We're also going to hear from Rick Blackman, West London lad, musician, political campaigner and writer. And he's written a book called 40 Miles of Bad Road, the Stars Campaign for Interracial Friendship and the Notting Hill Race Riots. Rick will be here between 10:30 and 11, so half an hour from now. Now and also back a bit to the 1950s, to a very troubled time in a part of London that is very dear to my heart, because we're going back to the sort of Notting Hill race riots and all of the events that took place in that part of W10, W11 back in the 50s, because there's a new book out called 40 Miles of Bad Road, the Stars Campaign for Interracial Friendship and the Notting Hill Riots by Rick Blackman. And Rick is here with us now. Welcome to the show, Rick.
Morning, Robert.
What led you to this, first of all? How did you sort of end up getting interested in all of this?
It was just a chance thing, really. I was just looking on the internet one night on YouTube, and I came across a clip of a guy called Colin Jordan, who was a leader of the White Defence League.
Yeah, which was a fascist organisation in the 50s, yeah.
And a little clip on them from Panorama, a Panorama programme from 1959, and the first clip was about the White Defence League, and the second part of the clip was on the Stars Campaign for Interracial Friendship, and an interview with Johnny Dankworth, Lonnie Donegan, Cleo Lane. And to me, it just, what is this? I've never heard of this.
No, I'd never heard of it. Well, funnily enough, I'd never heard of it until Billy Bragg was on the show about 3 weeks ago, because he's got a new book about SCIF,
yes.
And he mentioned it then.
Yeah, he did. But Billy took most of his stuff for his book from mine, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I was the first one, really, to find out about this organisation, and for me it just sounded almost exactly the same as Rock Against Racism.
Yeah. Sort of jazz against racism.
But it pretty much, and Skiffle as well.
Yeah.
And Skiffle as well. So, so very interesting, very similar story. It starts with the same thing with two guys who write a letter to the Melody Maker immediately after the riots, in the same way as what happened with Rock Against Racism. And from there, the campaign sort of gets a head of steam up from there. And within a week or so, it's a fully fledged organisation. And they were the first people, really, to come out against the racism of the riots, and the first people to organise themselves to start doing fundraisers and mainly gigs, because it was predominantly musicians. But they were the first people to do anything in response to the riots. For
those who don't know about the Notting Hill riots, let's put that in context. Give us the brief kind of outline of what was going on there.
Okay, very quickly. Many things contributed to it. You can't really identify a single issue that was the cause of the riots, but housing was certainly...
Overcrowding, slum dwellings.
Exacerbated by the 1957 Housing Act, where the Conservative government changed the law that allowed, that took away the sort of tenancy rights that people had, and allowed landlords to charge as much money as they wanted to. And
sort of Rachman's Charter.
This is where Rachman comes in and evicts with menaces a lot of the white families that are there. And because many of the black families that have emigrated over here couldn't find anywhere else to live, they get put in the houses where the white people have just been kicked out by Rachman. So this, of course, adds fuel to the fire. So that's certainly part of it. All of this, of course, happens in the shadow of where Grenfell is now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's been a consistency of bad housing for people, working class people who live in that area, going all the way back to the 1880s, where most of the housing was considered unfit for human habitation.
Well, I mean, talking about Grenfell, I discovered an extraordinary quote that just like sent shivers down my spine. In 1880 something or other, Charles Dickens, who was also a journalist and and a social reformer as well as a novelist, described that bit of London as the Avernus of Kensington. Now, I had to look up the word Avernus. I didn't know what it meant. It's a very sort of Victorian term, and it means literally the gateway to hell.
Right.
And he was talking about where Grenfell is.
Yeah.
I mean, so suddenly we're back in hell, 100 years later.
Pretty much, yeah. Nothing's changed.
No, extraordinary.
One criticism you can't level at the Conservative Party is inconsistency when it comes to housing.
Anyway, so let's get back to 1958.
Yes.
And so you've got this kind of, this bubbling, seething, whatever it is, of, people who are got poor housing, other people being evicted, new people moving in who look a bit different, come from a different place and all of that sort of stuff. And it erupts into, what, a couple of nights of rioting, of violence?
It sort of slowly builds up over the summer. The first real incident is in Shepherd's Bush on the SQ Road, where a group of teddy boys smash up a black-owned calf. So that's the first. You can really identify that as the first sort of rumblings, and then it sort of continues, and it builds and builds towards the bank holiday, and then there's just sustained rioting, and it's not really rioting because there's no really reciprocal violence from the black community. These are literally sort of 200, 300, 400 mobs of mainly teddy boys, but not solely.
And that area was very big teddy boy kind of. It was the heartland, wasn't it? Really, of all of that.
Yeah. And it's fueled as well by organised fascists that are operating in the area. So all the big nights of trouble that happen after there's been a meeting from either the White Defence League hasn't yet formed, but there's an organisation called the League of Empire Loyalists who are very active in the area, and also Mosley's union movement as well.
Who are based right in Notting Hill, aren't they?
Yeah.
They had their headquarters.
Both groups. So the White Defence League that forms immediately after, which is Colin Jordan's mob, they've got a shop front which just says, White Defence League, and basically is arguing for repatriation of all black people, and they're situated right in the heart of Notting Hill. Mosley moves his headquarters to Notting Hill Gate as well. So there's two of the main fascist parties that are having nightly meetings during the riots.
Which is strange because we tend to think of Mosley and the fascists as being in the east end of London, but in the post-war period they're based over there, aren't they?
Yeah, they move, and they don't drop the anti-Semitism that they sort of worked on in the 1930s. It's still there.
It just gets added to.
Yeah, but the main emphasis is anti-black immigration.
How kind of welcoming a voice did they find among the local white population, do you think?
It's a bit ambiguous, really. And it's difficult to find any objective reporting about the thing, because half of the time the media and the police want to deny that it's happening, so they don't report the racism. And on the other hand, people aren't that willing to necessarily come out and say that they're in defence of immigration. So it's difficult to find any actual information.
So this happens, and it becomes a big national story, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like no other, really. I mean, it kicked off in a couple of places in Deptford and in Camden in the early 50s, but these were sort of minor skirmishes. But I would argue, and I do argue in the book, that the reason why it escalates to the level it does is because of the organised fascist activity that's behind the thing.
Is there an organised response from the left at all?
The Communist Party are the main group outside the left, outside the Labour Party on the left, and they organise and they put these sort of defence campaigns for people going out and doing their shopping, because there's basically a curfew around Notting Hill at night. Tony Benn talks about it in his diaries, actually, because he was living up in Notting Hill, and he just says that it's not safe for black people to go outside the house.
Because we've also got the Kelso Cochrane murder around about this time, haven't we?
May 1959. So,
which is kind of the Stephen Lawrence of its age, I guess.
Absolutely. A guy with his arm in a sling walking home from hospital. He'd injured himself at work, and he gets attacked by four guys. Who later, the guy that killed him said that he was in the union movement, and admits on his deathbed that he killed in a racially motivated attack. So, but the Stephen Lawrence comparison is there, but the difference in the time periods is quite startling, because immediately after Kelso Cochrane's killed, Mosley has fascist meetings on the exact spot where this guy's been killed. I mean, you just can't imagine that sort of thing happening in London today. It's just like another world, really. So
all these musicians, this is all happening. What do they do?
Right. Well, the first thing they have a meeting at Johnny Dankworth's office in Denmark Street, and they decide what it is, what sort of organisation it's going to be. And although it's clearly a political organisation, it's not a party political organisation. So they're just going to campaign on the single issue of anti-racism and against violence. Racial violence, again, very similar to Rock Against Racism in the 70s. They appoint Laurence Olivier as the chairperson. Well, apparently Olivier agrees to do it on the condition that he doesn't have to do anything. Right. So he's up there as a sort of figurehead. Yeah. And then they go around recruiting people, really. Johnny Dankworth is the vice chair, and he's really the sort of spokesperson for...
Who else is involved?
For just all the great and the good of the media world of the 1950s, really. Tommy Steele, Lonnie Donegan, they're the biggest high-profile members, pop stars, Marty Wilde, and then there's a whole group of other, Tubby Hayes, Ronnie Scott, Chris Barber, Acker Bilk, Peter Sellers, Max Bygraves, George Melly, Colin McInnes. So there's a whole flurry of people that rushed to sign this statement that SCIF put out.
Who's SCIF?
The Stars Campaign for Interracial Friendship.
Right.
Not to be confused with Skiffle. Yeah. So a lot of skiffle bands. Humphrey Littleton, who's got his own club, he organises this. They start to organise a whole bunch of gigs, interracial gigs.
Whereabouts? In Soho or over in West London?
Both.
Right.
The first club is the first thing they do actually is they have a Christmas party in a school in Notting Hill Gate in 1958. And that's filmed by the BBC, which unfortunately... I
wonder what school, do you know?
It's on Kensington Park Road, but I can't remember the name of it. No. But it's in the book.
Right.
So the BBC film it, which has been sadly lost. Bizarrely, the American Embassy fund all the food and the drink, and the Americans are in no position to be talking about integrated lunches in 1958. So that's the first thing they do. The second thing they do is a little club called the Harmony Club, which they situate in Blenheim Crescent, which is right in the heart of where all the violence had been. And that's under constant arson threat, or the people that run the club are given death threats all the time. But they try to encourage Teddy boys to go there. The most important thing about these places that they set up is they're interracial. And there's still a colour bar in operation all over the country, really, but especially in that area that black people could go into a pub. If they got into a pub, but some, they wouldn't necessarily be served. They could stand there all night and they get blanked. So these are clubs that are open to both people, both black and white people, and they want people to dance together and drink together. And there's live music there. Cleo Lane, Dankworth again, the Jazz Couriers they play. There's a whole, all the people that are involved. George Melly, Paul Robeson is
Paul
involved
Robeson
as well. Yeah,
wow.
Yeah, because at this point Robeson. He's been kicked out of the States under the sort of McCarthyite witch hunts, so he's living in London at the time.
Yeah.
And another Trinidadian woman called Claudia Jones.
Yeah, I've heard of Claudia.
Who was also kicked out of the States as well. She operates in West London. She's a member of SCIF as well. So she organises lots of things, not least the first carnival in 1959.
So what happens to SCIF? How long does it operate for?
It's only really around for about 14, 15 months. And it's a reactive organisation, really, because the two things that motivate it are the riots and then Kelso Cochrane's murder. So by the end of 59, after Mosley loses the October general election, he stands in North Kensington ward. And after he loses that with a derisory vote. Yeah,
because it's interesting, isn't it? Because on the one hand, we're sort of saying that the support for, or certainly the far right and Mosley in particular, are kind of whipping up the riots, and they got all the teddy was, and yet no one votes for him. It doesn't. So there's not a kind of a deep well of support there.
No, it's a superficial. There's a hostility to immigration, what's deemed to be sort of mass immigration at the time, but laughable figures really. In the whole of the country, I think there's little more than 150,000 people that have come over from the Caribbean. So we're talking tiny numbers. There's a sort of knee-jerk reaction to it that's fostered.
I think there's also, from talking to members of my own family and from people who lived in that area at that bit of the time, I think what there also was a degree of almost like these, and I'm going to use the words that were used to me, these incredibly good-looking young black guys arrive dressed to the nines, walking along the streets, and all the local sort of Herberts and Teddy boys are suddenly like jealous.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? The girls are looking at them. There's almost a sort of an inferiority complex going on in some senses.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that is known to have sparked the Nottingham riots, which happened just before the Notting Hill riots, is about these young black guys who are coming over, and all the local women are just saying, well, we know who we'd rather be with.
Yeah.
So there is a sort of jealousy and a hostility to that in a similar way, I think, that happened with American troops in the Second World War.
I think you can sort of see it almost as a continuum of that, can't you? So it's racist, but it's not necessarily a politicised racism. It's
not in the whole, I would say.
Yeah.
not in the whole. But there are certainly some. There's
there's people who are trying to turn it there, aren't there?
Yeah. And Moseley recruits from in the 30s. Moseley had these guys called the Biff Boys, who were basically working class
sort of boxers
muscle. And they got replaced by Teddy Boys in the 50s, and they were the ones that would go out and sort of...
It's also remarkably like, I guess, the kind of skinheads of the late 70s, early 80s, isn't it? You're looking for the sort of the troopers for your movement, if you like.
Yeah, very much. And I don't know, I would argue that the Teddy Boys aren't really a subculture that's rooted in music in the same way that sort of mods and skinheads were later, because, they come out in 1950, although they're associated with rock and roll. They're a fully formed subculture for 5 years before they attach themselves to the music.
I argue that in the book I wrote, The Way We Wore, I say the first ever Best Dressed Teddy Boy competition was in 1953. Yeah. There's no rock and roll then whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't really come from music. It's more of a kind of a post-war spiv sort of continuation, really.
Yeah, and associated with petty crime and violence to a certain extent as spivs were as well.
Does it all just kind of fade away? Or?
Well, the racism doesn't, unfortunately. But after Moseley loses the election, he sort of spends more and more time in France. He comes back again in '66 to stand for another election. That's the last thing he does politically, really, in England. But the sort of wind is taken out of his sails, really, and not just from the Stars campaign, but also other local groups campaigning against Moseley, and there's a beginning really of what we see as an organised resistance to racism that starts, and like the campaign for racial equality evolves. Everything sort of starts, really comes out of the smoking embers of Notting Hill Gate, and from then on that's where you sort of see what we understand now as a tradition of anti-racism in London and in Britain as a whole. It comes from that particular period. Because
it's also interesting because I could argue and have argued that bit of West London in that bit of time, undoubtedly it has the race riots besmirching its name and all of that, and shameful, and Kelso Cochrane's terrible murder. It's also probably the first place where you get genuine multiculturalism. It's the first place where you've got white guys wanting to dress like the black guys and dance to the music of this, and they're sharing. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, McInnes was one of the Colin McInnes was one of the most tireless members of SCIF. And
he's a gay man, I guess, as well.
He's a gay man who's got a black boyfriend or several black boyfriends over the period. So it is sort of like got a vested interest in it, if you like. But he goes around all the clubs, and the SCIF produce broadsheets, newspapers where they argue against racism. They produce 2 of those over the year, and McInnes is really enthusiastic, and he's putting these through letterboxes, and they're giving them out on the streets. This is not a bunch of lovies that are just sort of go into their own clubs and argue against racism.
Because they're quite tough streets to walk down in those days.
Yeah. And especially with a fascist presence as well. I mean, during the 1959 election campaign, Moseley has 2 meetings a day.
Wow.
And the White Defence League are also having meetings where they're supporting Moseley. So the concept that you could have, like, inside and outside, 2 meetings a day with Moseley, where there's 200-300 people going to them. But members of SCIF and the local community also are going out, handing out newsletters and arguing against this racism. And, this is not for the faint-hearted.
It's fascinating stuff. And particularly when, you walk along those streets now and everything has changed and nothing has changed, if you like. Yeah,
except it's very white. The houses are white and so are the people.
Unless you're in Grenfell Tower, unless you're in that little enclave, really, which is actually where most of this took place even then.
Yeah,
really.
Absolutely.
Because I remember one of my cousins saying to me, they weren't the Notting Hill race riots, they were Notting Dale race riots.
Yeah.
And that's where they nearly all happened, was down there.
Yeah.
Really.
And I argue in the book that they're not race riots, they're racist riots.
Yeah.
Because there's only self-defence that comes from the black community.
It's fascinating stuff. Where can people get the book, Rick?
Book is available at the moment from Bookmarks, which is a shop in Bloomsbury, and then will be available later on in the year from Waterstones and the normal outlets. And that's 40 Miles of Bad Road. Why is it called that? It's a Dwayne Eddy song from 1958, so I thought I've got to have some musical connection, and that seemed to be the best thing to describe the sort of woeful tale that happened. Rick Blackman, thank you very, very much. It's just approaching 11 o'clock. It's time for the news headlines, but first up, it's the travel with Pippa Sparks.